Yeah, I mean, so as I kind of told you in the email, because you did the stories of women in neuroscience, we don't need to go over too much of your biography, because I guess you already covered that at length there. But I was just curious, you mentioned kind of one thing that I thought was kind of interesting, and I thought we could maybe start there. You said that kind of you finished school very young, and then you quickly were kind of lost and didn't really know what you were doing. I'm just curious, like, what do you think it would have been better if you'd, like, you know, taken a bit longer for school and that kind of stuff? Or do you think it was kind of good to finish that very quickly and then kind of have that little crisis fairly early on and work through it?
Yeah, you know, I don't know. I mean, in hindsight, it's hard to say, right? That process could have be the reason why I am where I am today. So, you know, it's hard to say. I think if I would have found this path with a little bit less anxiety and stress, meaning starting a little later, that would be ideal. But it didn't happen that way, and I still got here, so it all worked out for the best. But yeah, as you mentioned, I graduated high school at 16, which I think was very young for many reasons, like socially and emotionally, and that started a journey to self-discovery, which ultimately led me to neuroscience. So it all worked out in the end.
Yeah. I mean, I want to talk, mainly about invasive recordings in humans in particular. Yeah. I mean, what you do. Maybe can we start, when was the first time you started working with invasive recordings in humans, maybe?
Yeah, I was a graduate student. I was in my, I want to say maybe second or third year, and working with Dr. Itzhak Fried at UCLA and Arne Ekstrom, who was a postdoc at the time. And we were recording, single neuron activity in patients who have had implanted electrodes in the hospital. And I'm still doing that kind of work today, as well as other type of invasive recordings.
Especially want to talk about, like, how these invasive recordings changed over time. So maybe I'm curious, like, what was the status then? Like, what kind of things could you do with invasive recordings then? And maybe also what kinds of patients were you working with? And then we can maybe use that as a basis for, like, discuss how it changed over time.
Sure. Yeah, it's quite different. But back then, we had really two ways of recording invasively. One is in the operating room, which I didn't do so much of. And the other is in the hospital, in what's called the epilepsy monitoring unit. So these are patients with epilepsy who are implanted with electrodes for 1 week, 2 weeks, for as long as it takes for them to capture enough seizures so they can determine where the seizures, are coming from. And during this time, these patients will volunteer for research studies where we would go into the hospital room, take our laptops, and basically show them pictures on a screen or have them do tasks while we're recording from microwires that can record single unit activity. So that was what it was like back then. I think it's, changed quite a bit to now. The technology is leading that way. The technology is improving. We're no longer limited to operating rooms and hospital settings in patients who are either undergoing surgery or have just undergone surgery. So these devices are now chronically implanted, which extends them into the realm of everyday life. So these patients have these devices implanted as they're going about their, everyday activities. And so at-home studies are feasible. Bringing them into the lab for studies, that is now possible. And so I think it's evolved to the point where we can ask questions about naturalistic human behavior in more ecologically valid settings.
Yeah, I mean, is it still today mainly epilepsy patients, or are there other kinds of patients that also have these?
No, so that's another big change, is that, majority of studies are done in epilepsy patients, but now there are patients, with psychiatric disorders that are implanted with these electrodes, depression, PTSD, OCD, others. So it's becoming more diverse in terms of the patient population in which we are using these types of recordings.
I'm assuming, also with the psychiatric cases that's, only if it's so bad that nothing else seemed to work, or are there...
Right.
Okay. So is that, I don't know, is that like a common...
No, in the case of PTSD, it's quite difficult to find these patients that are qualified for these studies because they have to have, undergone treatment various other forms of treatment. And actually that's one of the challenges, is that not everybody gets adequate, treatment to the point where they're really offered all of these treatments. So for our PTSD study, for instance, we have to find individuals that have basically tried many, many treatments, and those have failed for them. So it's a smaller population than otherwise.
Do you find that, I've heard from some people who work with clinical populations that one of the problems often with clinical populations is that they're, the disorder, or however you call it, that the reason kind of why they're eligible for the study is often the reason why they're not particularly good participants. Because, if you have certain psychiatric conditions, you might not respond very well or not turn up or all that kind of stuff. I'm curious, do you also have that with, because you have such a small population of people you can access, is that like a heightened problem for you, or?
Yeah, that is true. We definitely try to recruit individuals who are highly motivated to contribute to research, and that is usually a very important thing in terms of ensuring that they'll be willing to do these things, even when things are really difficult in their personal lives. But yeah, it is definitely challenging.
So you had a paper out recently in Nature Neuroscience about a kind of new system you developed. For me, as someone who doesn't do this kind of research, it wasn't sometimes entirely clear what I don't know exactly how these technologies work, or what the precise advancements of that was. You obviously described some of it, but I'm curious whether you could put a bit more context to kind of what you did there, what you developed, and how that kind of, what the improvement is there compared to previous methods.
So that paper you're referring to, it was regarding the Neurostack system, which is a handheld system device that is made of implant-sized circuits, meaning that it could be minimized to be even smaller and implantable, and essentially fit in the size of a pill. So this system, which is handheld, it's wearable, so people can walk around with it on, and it can record multi-channel, so up to 256 local field potential activity and 32 channel single unit activity. And so this is a major, advance, because up until, this device, the systems that record single neuron activity, they're cart size, they're very bulky and big and heavy, and patients and participants, they have to be sitting down and tethered to the system. So the Neurostack enables basically recording of single neuron activity during walking. And we recorded some neurons, we showed that we could record neuron activity while an individual is walking back and forth in their hospital room. And the second sort of major advantage, there are others, but another major advantage is that it's full duplex. So it can record this activity and stimulate at the same time. And it can do this in real time based on a neurophysiological feature that for example, the phase of an ongoing theta oscillation. It could stimulate at a particular phase, and it's fully programmable. So you can stimulate with any kind of waveform, any pattern, any combination of electrodes. So it's really a scientist's ideal tool. And that's really where it stemmed from. It was a conversation between neuroscientists, myself, and engineers, and telling them essentially what would be the ideal tool for scientists that could help us not only understand the human brain, but develop therapies for patients that are, more effective. And so that was the main advantage of the system.
Mm-hmm. For example, I talked to Matthias Stangl about your Nature paper. That was still with the old system. Or was that already? Because you're also moving.
Yeah,
there,
so
right?
that's the old system. Right. So everything other than, the Neurostack right now cannot record single neuron activity. It can record, basically oscillatory activity or intracranial EEG. And those are the devices that are implanted in several thousand people right now who are going about their daily lives. So that's a major advantage, that we can even record intracranial EEG during movement, during walking, during mobile behaviors. The Neurostack, however, advances further beyond that by allowing, single neuron activity. These patients are still confined to a hospital setting, but they could walk. They could walk in the hallways. They could walk in their room. And so you can, start to, for example, bridge the gap between single neuron recordings and freely moving animals, which is a very large, part of the field.
Yeah. I'm reminded kind of, if I remember correctly, the story, for example, of play cells is that, you couldn't record from a moving rat. And then they developed that, and then it didn't take that long for place cells to be discovered after that. Exactly. So it's kind of really exciting to imagine like all the stuff you can do now with this system in. I mean, I guess the main advantage is, now you have humans who could like tell you what's going on.
Exactly.
At least some things. And
be instructed to do something very quickly, right? So we can. Yeah, so that's very exciting for me. Yeah.
Have you already started using that for new studies and kind of?
We have one that is being designed right now and piloted, and hope to get some data in the next few months. Yeah.
Okay, but you can't say what topic it is, or.
Oh, topic it's on what you would probably expect based on what you just said. Can we find place cells or grid cells, and can we tie them to memory and human experience and human recollections that are reported? Yeah, that sort of thing.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, it feels a bit silly now hearing you talk about kind of what you can do now that you couldn't do before, and then ask about like what's missing, what you'd like to develop in the future, that kind of stuff.
But there is.
Yeah, so I'm curious, like, what are kind of the big, I don't know, maybe the bottlenecks to certain things. Maybe even now you see like, I mean, we want to do this study, but we still can't do it because of X or Y. Kind of what are the big challenges maybe that you'd like solved?
Yeah, I mean, there are actually many. And so, there's still lots of things we have to improve. One being just the user friendliness of these systems so that more people can, enter this field using the system. So it's a very small group of people doing this right now. We also can always do better with the accuracy of synchronization between these signals and peripheral signals that we capture, like movement of the body, movement of the eyes, and other biometric recordings. We record heart rate, skin conductance, respiration. I mean, you name it, on-body wearables are advancing at the same time as these neural recording devices. So integrating those is a big challenge, and getting the synchronization accurate. Another thing we can do better on is developing better wearables that, are easy to use at home by the patients themselves, user-friendly again, and how to synchronize that remotely without a scientist or researcher there. And then doing better with the wearables, we have a grant proposal that was submitted earlier this year to integrate with the NeuroStack some biochemical wearables. So they've developed these smartwatches that can sample biochemicals in the sweat, such as cortisol, adrenaline. And so we are hoping to, add these kind of features, enhance the NeuroStack with these kind of features, so that we can look at, various states, emotional states, and other things.
Yeah. I mean, are the kind of virtual reality, I don't really exactly want to call it a boom, because I guess not many people are using it right now, but I mean, Apple introducing that kind of product, to me, it seems from someone from the outside, it seems like that's like a huge benefit to the community. I mean, I remember I did some stuff with like virtual reality headset a while ago with like, not new recordings, but in a lab, and I think they still used like a system that cost like $9,000 or something. That was like this old clunky tech that was developed, and I think at the time Oculus Rift came out, and they were like, well, we might as well just buy two because they're so cheap compared to what the old stuff is. I'm curious, like, I mean, I'd also, for example, imagine that they're going to have really amazing eye tracking and AR integrations, that kind of stuff. Have you tried that already, like the Apple thing? Because that's not out yet, right?
I haven't tried it. No, I haven't tried it, but it's definitely on our radar, and we're excited to see how it works and see if we can use it. So yeah, that is a big potential advancement, is integrating the virtual reality and augmented reality headsets, eye tracking headsets, and that's something we're following. I remember when I first started my lab, we had a Google Cardboard, and
what's a Google Cardboard?
Oh, Google Cardboard. It's literally a piece of cardboard that's folded to fit a phone.
Oh, yes, I remember that.
So it's using, it's virtual reality, but, basically using your phone. It's like, I don't know, really cheap, $5 or $10, I don't know, something really cheap. And, now we have these really fancy headsets with eye tracking and AR. And so I think the challenge there is still going to be synchronization. So how much can I, as a developer, use these systems to get it working well with the neural recording devices? That's to be seen. So I don't know how easy that will be. And that's going to be the main bottleneck. And can we get the synchronization? These neural signals we're recording at 30,000 times per second, right? How good of a synchronization can we get with these signals? That's going to be the major challenge.
I mean, I'm curious, like one thing about these, I mean, so this is all, still in patients, right? Is there any, do you think this is going to happen, or under which conditions in normal people that you can actually implant these things or find some sort of, some sort of way of recording activity in normal people, or in healthy people? I mean, I did an episode with Gareth Barnes about the new MEG systems. So that's, there's some way of getting neurosignals from healthy people when they're moving, that kind of stuff. But at a, invasive single cell, do you think that's ever going to happen in healthy people, or is it?
I mean, even though it seems really far and maybe impossible now, I'm not one to say anything is impossible with what I've sort of just seen in my small lifetime, which is that the development of a new technology can be totally catch us off, guard and unexpected, and that can completely change the field, overnight. So I'm definitely not one to say that's impossible. That if we can develop the right method or tool to do this, I will say it's going to be very challenging because, these signals, recording them, especially from deep brain areas, non-invasively, is got many, many challenges. But like you mentioned, the OPM MEG systems or, other systems that are starting to work towards that may be possible one day. So who knows?
But invasively in healthy people, that's just because of ethical
in
problems.
Healthy people, you got to always take into account the risk with surgery. Until we can do brain surgery without basically no risk, then maybe that is possible, right? But there's always that risk. And why would you put someone through that kind of risk if they don't need it? That's always the question, ethically speaking.
Yeah, I mean, I guess some people are interested in any kind of potential improvement for normal people, or whatever, but I feel like that's pretty far off. I don't know what you...
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I think there's so many people that have, problems, brain disorders that need this, and focusing on those problems, I think, are, at least for my work, are more important to think about than how can we enhance sort of normal function, especially with a risky procedure like this. It doesn't seem responsible.
Yeah, especially how do you improve these things in healthy people? That's one of the first big questions.
Right. I mean, and there may be ways to do it non-invasively. So that, of course, is of interest of mine as well. Can we improve healthy function non-invasively, or can we improve, function even in those who are not healthy non-invasively? That's always going to be the first choice than doing it invasively.
Yeah. So just a kind of slightly random question maybe, but I'm curious, do you have any opinion on what the people at Neuralink are doing?
So I know I'm familiar with the technology. I knew I met with the scientist, Dr. Sabes, who developed the sort of original technology. So I'm familiar with it, and it has a lot of advantages. And so, by all means, I'm excited to see a lot of resources put in this area, and it's definitely had an impact on the interest in this type of approach. So there's a lot of benefit there, and if they can reach even part of their goals, I think it's going to, be advantageous for the rest of the field.
Okay, so it's because to me, it's, you hear about occasionally they have some press conference, and it seems like a lot of people deride kind of what they do and the goals that they have. And then it seems like from the engineers, though, there's often a kind of, no, there's some solid stuff they're doing here. So it sounds to me kind of you're saying basically the engineering side of they're doing good stuff. It's just what they're going to achieve with it, maybe. So.
Exactly. That part may be, marketing or overblown, but the engineering aspect, I'm always a fan of try to reach for the stars. If you get to the clouds, it's still better than nothing. So I think on the engineering side, putting that much resources into advancing the technology is going to be positive.
As you know, I talked to Matthias Stange, and he spoke very highly of you and how you run your lab. So I thought it might be good to hear about how you do that, or maybe how you try and do it. Because I've definitely also heard of people who say that they work in labs that are not particularly nice to work in. So I think a lot of people can probably learn about some of the things you do. Obviously, I want to make this question slightly more specific than how do you run a good lab. You mentioned in the stories of women in neuroscience that mentorship is kind of one of your favorite aspects of your job and of what you do. I thought maybe we could start there. Maybe what do you try and do as a mentor with your, let's say, grad student or postdoc, and kind of, yeah.
Yeah, I think the word try is definitely the key word there. There are many things I think that are important that I could list, like communication and aligning expectations and, defining roles. But for me, in terms of what I strive to do with mentorship is, really every person is a little different, and learning each mentee's strength and area that they may want to improve is really important for me to help mentor them. So I try to really, find where are the things that they want to, improve upon, and what kind of support can I give them. So the kind of work in my lab is very interdisciplinary. It really cannot be done by one person. And so I try to maintain a lab with a lot of support staff and in different areas. So they have different strengths. So we have for instance, we have a VR programmer, we have a, designer, 3D artist, we have engineer, we have, a lot of folks who can help the, graduate students or postdocs with their projects. So they're not feeling like they have to do it all themselves. And I think that is really critical. And then teamwork, related to that, right? So trying to create a culture, an environment that is really putting teamwork at a forefront. So everybody's very helpful to each other, cooperative and not competitive. And that really, I believe, starts with the PI. And so I really, tried to promote that kind of environment and that culture. And then what else? Just trying to really be there for each individual. It's been a rough few years, the last few years, and being flexible and supportive and having the mental space in my own life, self-care to be able to support other individuals, I think is critical. So I'm still learning a lot about how to be a good mentor. I think each person teaches me several new things because mentoring each person is different. And I'm also being mentored in some ways by these individuals. So it's a relationship that we're building. And yeah.
I'm curious, just because I guess I'm not a mentor, but a mentee. What makes for a good mentee?
Yeah, what do I look for in folks that we bring on into the team? I think most importantly is, are they a team player? Are they going to be not just, focused on necessarily their own stuff and what they need, but are they willing to help others? And like I said, that goes back to what I mentioned about the work that we do, in that no one person can do all aspects of the project. And so we need this teamwork. Teamwork is the core of every project that we do. So are they a team player? Are they willing to, help others? And then, do they have some sort of resilience in terms of being able to overcome challenges, small or big, in terms of like technical challenges or when things don't work. I mean, science is, anybody in science knows, like, at least if you're doing science right, most of the time you're failing at things or things aren't working, right? Otherwise you're not taking enough risks. So in the day-to-day of what we do, there are a lot of roadblocks, challenges, things aren't working. And are they the kind of person that can really try, put in the effort to overcome these things, whether it's do it themselves or get people to help them or, communicate the challenge. So are they good troubleshooters? Are they good at solving problems? And adaptable and flexible, and because we don't really know what problems there will be when we try to do these things. So
how do you assess that? I mean, if you have an interview and you say, "Are you a team player?" I think there are a few people who are going to say no.
I don't say. Right. I don't ask that. Actually, that's not the best way, I think, to assess that. I have a lot of conversations with these people. I get to know them. I think that's really important, and to get to know people. And then I love stories. Like, tell me about some examples. Tell me stories. What challenges have you had in your research project, and go into detail about it? How did you overcome it? What didn't work? What did work? So when you start to listen to these stories, you get to know the person, right? And then you start to get a sense.
Oh, so yeah, that's funny. It's just I just realized that there was a parallel to the whole question of journal impact and all that kind of stuff, and then people say well, how am I supposed to assess the quality of a paper if I don't use the journal name? And then you read the paper.
Yeah, you read
and
the
it
paper.
seems like it's similar. You talk
use
to
your
them.
Brain. Yeah. You think. Use your brain.
Yeah, but yeah, I'm curious just because I kind of a little bit by accident ended up spending quite a lot of time with Matthias talking about postdoc applications and that kind of stuff. And one thing kind of he mentioned, for example, that surprised me to some extent, and by extension probably also some of the listeners who are in a similar position to me, was that he first just mailed people and said hey, a few people, and said I think you do cool stuff, and this is kind of how I'd fit in. And then that he also contacted people who did things that were in many ways quite different from what he did before. So for example, he had experience with fMRI in age. I think it was fMRI of aging in particular, in terms of spatial navigation and memory. And then basically almost none of that is, for example, in the Nature paper that you two did together. Right. So I'm just, he very much said well, it's a strength that you have a different perspective you can bring to the lab and that kind of stuff. I'm curious, what's, to maybe hear your side of that conversation I had with him.
Yeah. And I'll say, so I first met Matthias at SFN. That was our in-person interview at that time. He gave me a little short, presentation on his research, and then we just talked. We are at a coffee shop, just talking. And I pretty much knew right away that I wanted to recruit this person into my lab. And as you said, he had no experience doing any of the recordings that we do, right? But that absolutely did not matter to me. What I saw in Matthias was, number one, absolutely genuinely nice person, team player, no question. And number two, he can solve problems. And he can pretty much do anything he wants, right? So, he, with the right determination, that was also very evident to me. So yeah, it's the experience is not necessarily what's important. It's how committed and resilient are you to being able to solve an unknown, right? That's what we're doing in science. That's the goal. The goal is not to do just these incremental, improvements in our knowledge, right? We want to make these revolutionary discoveries. No one no one's in science to just, we're here to make change, right? And so that's what I saw in him, and that's what I try to look for in folks that I recruit in the lab. And he submitted his first paper. He collected all the data and submitted his first paper to Nature in under a year. He's amazing.
Yeah. That's the new bar now, I'm assuming. For new,
oh gosh,
for new
I know. I feel
for
anybody else that comes into my lab, And I also make another point about his study. His study that we ended up doing was not what we had planned to do originally, and this maybe will touch upon some advice to postdocs. Is that it was a totally sort of side, out of the box idea that Matthias had and came to me with. Very sort of unusual and not something we would normally do. And luckily I had the insight to say, okay, let's drop everything else and do this, right? This is that good of an idea. And it's really risky and it might not work at all and we won't see anything, but who cares about that, right? So taking those risks and being open and flexible in your research, especially during the postdoc period, and unexpected opportunities or results may come and they can often lead to breakthroughs, right? So not being afraid to take those risks, I think, is important.
But what would, to some extent, I wonder whether, I don't want to focus this conversation too much on Matthias, but I guess it's just the example we're using right now. But, as a postdoc, if it doesn't work out at all, that is
Right. Well, we still were doing the other project, right? We didn't completely drop it. We temporarily, refocused, but we were still going to run this other project, which is still a fantastic project. And that way, there's a little bit less risk in that you have, multiple things going on. And I think that's also good advice.
So it's a kind of fairly standard, one risky, one safe project.
Yes,
kind of
exactly.
approach.
We do that in the lab for sure.
Okay. As a PI, obviously when you start as a PI, you're not really trained to be one. I mean, you might have supervised someone here or there. There's a little bit of the Peter principle going on, where everyone gets promoted to the level of incompetence, where you're, it's a bit different, but you're good as a PhD student, so you become a postdoc, then you're good as a postdoc, so you become a PI, and then you have to do things that you didn't really have to do before. So I'm curious kind of how do you do that kind of learning of skills that's very, also quite different from what you have to learn as a PhD student often, right? Because that's often a technical thing that's, read the book or the paper or whatever.
Right. I think that goes back to my comment about being adaptable and being resilient, right? So I feel like, folks that are really successful in this, or at least in my experience, are folks that can adapt, right? So, and are constantly trying to learn and improve, right? So what I'm doing now, the skills that I need to be good at now really have nothing to do with the ones that I learned in grad school. And so, I think that that's really important is being able to work on the skill of adaptability, flexibility, and learning, like constantly learning. Every day I'm learning something new. And my job right now is mentorship and supervising and providing the funding and the resources for these brilliant people to do what they do. So, those are the skills that I work on every day. But you're right. There's no training for that. Sadly.
Yeah. Is there some sort of like PI training or something like
I've
heard of some places where you have like a PI mentor or that kind of thing.
I definitely learned through observation of watching my mentors and PIs, and each one had a different strength, and I tried to emulate those strengths. And I also sought out some career development workshops, and, they have these training sessions for these kinds of skills, like, how to build a lab. And I think those are very useful. So putting some effort and time into learning these kinds of things formally or through observation, I think is important.
Okay. You mentioned something on the Stories of Women in Neuroscience podcast that I thought was kind of interesting, because I think you were asked about like a challenge or something, and then you mentioned it, but you didn't explain how you overcame it then. And then the conversation moved on. So we were basically, I think you said one thing that was very difficult for you was that you see yourself as someone who's quite shy, and so the networking thing was quite difficult, especially maybe as a woman in a quite male-dominated field. So that you mentioned that but you didn't say how. So I
didn't say how, meaning how I worked on it, or
exactly. It was just like, that was a problem. So I'm curious,
maybe because it's still a problem and something I'm working on still. I don't have a solution. It's networking has always been a major challenge for me, and it's funny because that's pretty much like a majority of my job now. But I think, I don't know if this helps at all, but it gets easier in a way that doesn't necessarily have to do with me so much. Yes, I needed to work on myself and learn how to, there are ways to help you network better, and those kind of things like workshops, I've done those, but I think part of it gets solved a little bit as you go ahead. As long as you just show up, show up and listen, right? Those are the two things I think that are really important in networking, is like doing a lot of active listening, where you're listening to people, meeting new people, and really engaging like actively in the conversation, not distracted, and, having just genuine relationships, right? But because I'm such a shy, introverted person, that definitely is challenging. And so I've had to like sort of, okay, no, I'm gonna go to this event, even though I don't want to right now, or, force myself to do these things. But what I was saying is that it does get easier because you start to make friends, right? You start to have all these friends. And when what I'm not shy when I'm around my friends and my family. So once you start to get to know people and you have these relationships and you see them regularly, multiple times per year even, then it just becomes easy. Then it becomes like a reunion every conference or whatever. So it gets easier. To those who are really shy and introverted and don't have a lot of friends in science, I will say it gets easier once you start to make those friends. So, maybe just focus on one or two relationships if it's difficult, and then over time you accumulate these relationships and it gets easier.
And at some point you get postdocs mailing you, so you can then just
right. So you don't have to, yeah. And that does happen almost every day, so which is great.
It really is that much.
It is that much. I don't know that people. I definitely didn't realize this as a graduate student and postdoc, that you get multiple emails per day from people who are interested, which is a huge privilege. And just trying to navigate through those.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a good problem to have.
It's a good problem to have. I would much rather it this way, yes. But I also feel for those on the other end when you can't respond right away, or you even forget to respond. It's tough. It's tough.
Yeah, I guess it's particularly because you're so used to it. There's maybe at some point you can also kind of forget what it's like to be the person mailing a PI and being nervous and reading your email like 20 times before you send it.
Exactly. And waiting for that response every day. Yeah. So I remember what it's like.
That's good. A book or paper that you think more people should read. This can be something very famous, something completely not famous. Just something makes you think like, oh, this is such a cool thing that I wish more people saw this.
That's tough. That's actually a very tough question. I mean, I came into this field reading about certain patients and case studies, Oliver Sacks' books, Brenda Milner's work. So, I have a bias. I guess I would recommend those original papers from way back then, describing, HM's condition of not being able to remember or form new memories for events in his life. Like those kinds of cases, they just absolutely fascinated me. And, and especially when they write it in a way that a non-scientist can understand, like how could you not totally be intrigued by this experience of this person's having just because of a brain, some brain damage or disorder. It's like when I read that, it's like I have to be part of the journey to try to figure out how to help, or figure out what's going on in the brain. It just amazed me.
Did you ever consider working with these kind of patients?
Yeah, no, I have. And, and I do still, I work with basically epilepsy patients that without HM would have gotten these surgeries. So luckily they're not getting these surgeries.
Yeah, but then they're not that interesting, are they? Like nothing against the people, but it's not as interesting as someone like HM.
Well, they do have episodes, right, of amnesia. In fact, I've had one myself. So, I've had a personal experience with amnesia. I mean, so I've had a little bit of experience with that particular experience, but yeah, I mean, working. So
is that something you can share, or is that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it was when my first child was born. I basically had, transient global amnesia where I woke up in the hospital and didn't have any idea why I was there. And I basically lost like 5 to 10 years of my life. I thought I was a graduate student. I remember them telling me that you just had a baby. And I was like, wait, how can I have a baby? And I started freaking out because I was like, I can't have a baby in Los Angeles. It's too expensive. How can I have a baby? I'm just a graduate student. So, I mean, obviously it was very scary at the time and I can laugh about it now because all the memories came back. But, but I had a day or two where I basically lost 5-10 years of my life. And that made this whole experience very personal for me. I still think about that day almost every day, and how I can try to understand what happened and what's going on. So
does that just come back, or like, what was it, like a graduate thing? Like, wait a minute, I am not a graduate student anymore, or like, was it sudden?
No, it wasn't. I can't pinpoint an exact time when it happened. So I would probably say that then it wasn't all of a sudden. It was gradual. It was just kind of like, okay, now I'm fully aware of what's going on, and I recognize my husband. I know, what's happening. So, but yeah, I mean, I try to put myself back in that time, but obviously my memory wasn't very good at the time, so it's really hard to know what's happening, which is why this research is also important, right? We need to understand the system, how it works.
Does it happen often? I've never heard of something like this.
It's pretty rare. There are cases of this where people have this, it's usually related to some kind of trauma or surgery complication, which in my case was the latter. And it comes back, and they're not known to be any long-term, effects. But there's quite a bit of research on this, and it's difficult to do, right? Because it's such a brief window of time, and you have to find these patients who are experiencing this at the right time and study them before, it's very difficult to do this kind of research in these patients with TGA. But it is a window into, potentially what's going on in terms of the memory system, but it's challenging. So we instead work with folks who don't have this going on, but we're trying to understand memory, the same memory system, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that question took a turn I did not expect.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, it was very interesting.
Learning a lot about me, I guess. Sharing.
Yeah. No, I mean, that was fascinating. I mean, this is always the best part, when you ask a question and it goes in a completely different direction.
Completely different direction. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, second question is something you wish you'd learned sooner, or if you don't like the supposed regret that's implied in that question, kind of maybe a lesson you'd like to share.
That's a great question, and it's hard for me to answer, because even if I say what I'm about to say now, I don't know that it would have necessarily helped me at the time. So what I would say is, I care, unfortunately, I think, as most people do, about what other scientists think about my work. And that if you care too much can also be very challenging to deal with, because early in starting my lab, I think, trying to do something totally different and new can come with, unfortunately, some negative resistance to that, to that new thing. So we had a tough time the first few years in terms of getting grants and getting papers published. And I really took that to heart, maybe too much. So if I would have gone back, tell myself, like, look, you really are onto something, keep it going, and don't listen to all of this. Don't let them get you so, down. But at the same time, if somebody would have told me that, I probably would have still, taken all that to heart. But that, I wish I would have, sort of not let it get to me so much. And it worked out. I mean, I didn't listen to the negativity, kept on doing what I was doing, and it all ended up working out. But sort of in hindsight, I'm like, okay, I mean, it makes sense why that was happening, because I'm trying to do something that is totally different, and not everybody is sort of necessarily on board with that.
So what was so different about what you wanted to do? Because as I said, I'm from the inside after it's been successful. So for me, it seems like an obvious choice, right?
Well,
afterwards, right?
After the fact.
Yeah.
I mean, when we first started, doing recordings in these patients who have these chronically implanted electrodes while they're walking around and moving, I mean, that no one had done that before, right? That was brand new. And many people had told me, and granting reviews told me, this is not really worth it. It's not going to work. Even if you get it to work, there's so many issues or limitations. Like, we can't really use it. It's not going to be good for anything. I mean, I had, I don't know, a whole folder full. I have a whole folder of grants that were rejected in the beginning. And the papers also got triaged and harsh reviews in the first few years. And I think looking back on that, now, right, is because it was different. It was really trying to start a new, sort of approach in this field. And, not everybody is going to necessarily be totally supportive of that or see the vision, right? And I will say there were many people that were really supportive. It was sort of like either all in. They were so excited about the vision, and I can think of those people, and since day one they were like, this is, you're onto something, keep going. But with that, you also have the other side. And so, not all advice is good advice. I would say that's the lesson I learned. And, you can ignore some of the bad advice.
Yeah.
But,
But how do you sift kind of through that to some extent? Is it just because because, it's very easy to go like, oh, these people are right. If assuming they're making decent arguments.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the things they said were right? So they were highlighting all the limitations and the challenges. But at the end of the day, when I heard all those things, I'm like, yeah, that's true. But the benefit outweighs all of those. So I'm going to keep going, So I always had to sort of go back to myself and trust my intuition, trust my gut, I guess, so to speak. And, this is worth it. Let's keep going. Yeah. Okay. Let me listen to their criticisms and use it to improve what I'm doing. Okay. Maybe the first lab that I built, a GoPro on the ceiling isn't going to get us the data we want to get. Okay. Let's spend a little more money and get good cameras or whatever that can capture motion, right? Let's do better. Let's keep integrating these comments if they're constructive, right? And that was very helpful. I think the ones that are not are like, okay, this is useless, this is worthless and not worth your time. I think that's the kind of advice that I definitely am glad that I ignored.
Mm-hmm. Talking of advice, I just handed in my PhD. Will be a postdoc soon. Do you have any advice for someone in my kind of position?
Well, first of all, congratulations. That's a huge milestone. I still remember that time in my life. But, in terms of like the unknown, right? Because there's a lot of unknowns and that caused me a lot of anxiety at the time. But it's a big deal. So congrats. And I guess advice at that stage. I think it will go back down to what I mentioned earlier, which is that, don't be afraid of sort of these unexpected turns in your postdoc or new opportunities. Like your postdoc is I think is a prime peak time where you are at your best, right? Like in terms of what you've learned and what you can apply and, learning new skills, of course, but applying the skills you have maybe in new ways. Like don't be afraid to necessarily go into areas that may seem uncomfortable, like Matthias did, in his postdoc, learning a completely new skill, but applying his knowledge to integrate with that. And then don't be afraid to think outside of the box and try, some crazy ideas if your PI is supportive of that.
Yes, so, in accordance with your PI's agreement.
Right.
Yeah, it's funny. I really like the advice. It's just today, I published an interview, my second interview with Adam Mastroianni, who said something very similar. And now I'm almost like, oh, damn, several people are like advising me to do something like unusual and brave. And I feel like I have to do something crazy now.
Why are we in science, right? That in the old days, right? Like the traditional scientist, the mad scientist or whatever back in the day. That's what scientists did. And I think, unfortunately this whole, publishing and grant mechanisms that we have made us all play it really safe. So we need a little bit more of that, I think. Okay. So it's not going to hurt.
More of a crazy scientist.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll get my hair really messy and look like there was an explosion or something like that.
Yeah, internally, not necessarily physically.
Okay.
In terms of your ideas, right? Like my favorite part of my job in my lab is sitting around with my lab members and just brainstorming crazy ideas. Not necessarily that we will implement, but like just, being creative. There's this whole aspect of creativity. Before I became a scientist, I wanted to be an artist. I think there's a huge part of that, being creative that we lose sometimes as we progress through academia, which we shouldn't, right? And that I think is the exciting part. And that's what makes, breakthroughs. I think that's what makes innovation. Have fun, right? Go back to that. Graduate, which one reason I love, meeting with graduate students, they still have that, and they're not, somehow we get jaded as we go through this academic life, but we need to go back to that. Yeah. Excitement, creativity.
Okay, I think that's a good word to end on.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. It's been fun.